I'm fully aware that women pay a high price to have babies. And with my wife, we went in for the birthing classes, and obviously this isn't Mother's Day, but it does tie in. And they taught us the breathing mechanics, and so they'd turn off all the lights, and it was supposed to be calm, and then I was supposed to help her relax from the toes to the shins to the knees, and talk to her about her breathing and tell her, okay, and they coached us all through this prior to the birth. And we're about, she had been in labor for 6 or 7 hours, and for those of you that haven't experienced it, it's not like in the movies. It ramps up slowly. But it was starting to get kind of intense, and I was sitting next to the bed, and I said, okay, babe, you got to breathe now. Now just imagine the relaxation in your toes. And I think this stuff is total bunk, but it's my job, right? This is what I was told I was supposed to do. So I'm trying to help her relax through her toes and through the soles of her feet and through her heels. I'm not 45 seconds into this thing when she looks at me and she says, "This Bradley stuff is crap." She says, "Shut up." And I, for the next however many hours, sat meekishly next to the bed. And every now and then I'd say, "Babe, you're doing great." And she'd shoot me a look like, "Why are you talking to me?" And there was they use these monitors to gauge how heavy the contractions are getting, and you can see it next to the bed. So you see it start to climb, and when it gets to the top of the contraction, it peaks and it starts to go back down. And on the meter, it started to hit about 20, 24. And she wanted a completely natural childbirth, and she told me my job was, if she asked for medicine or she asked for an epidural, to talk her out of it, right? Well, she started hitting 20, 24, somewhere in the 20 to 24 range. She said, "I don't think I can do this." She said, tell them I want medication. And I said, "Well, babe, you told me not to let you do this." And she said, "But I'll go talk to him." And so I went out and I told him, I said, she's in a lot of pain in there, and it's starting to hit like almost 24. And, is it going to get much higher than that? And she said, "Oh, sweetie, it'll be well over 100 before this is over." And she did at one point let me talk to her, and her mom came in and tried the breathing thing. She said, "Mom, shut up!" But she would get off the bed, like you saw the guy laying next to the bed, and she would kick the trash can. And she would look at the meter as it went up, and she'd say, "Go down, you sucker!" And I mean, it's just like this Tasmanian devil took over my wife. And eventually, she had the baby, and now she's done that twice now, and both times she said, "I'm never doing that again." And then a week later, it's like, "Oh, we need to have another baby pronto," right? But I recognize and I've seen the price that a woman pays to have a baby. And, just the toll that it takes on the female body, really, after you have a baby, it doesn't go back to the form it had before, typically. The morning sickness. And then I've seen afterwards, just raising a child. We do homeschooling, so I'm in my office every day listening to her homeschool the children and how they argue with her and bicker with her, and they don't, or Siler, doesn't want to do this work. He wants to do something else, but she's invested in his education, and she's always got meals ready for him. She's a live-at-home mom at this point, but she works her tail off. She probably works harder than I do to be a mom. And the more I've thought about it, I've thought about my mom a lot recently, because my mom died almost 2 years ago today. And that's her on the right. And I think the more I think about it, the more regret I have for not making her feel as admired as she should have been. Like, now that I've watched my wife give birth, and now that I've watched what it takes to raise a child, and I know the money, and I know the time, and I know the soccer classes, and I know how hard it is to invest in a child, I wish before my mom had died, because I basically got busy. And I went to school, I got a job, I wrote some books, I traveled, and I would communicate with her on the phone every couple days, and I would spend time with her once a week. But I wish that we had had like a daily friendship. And some people have that. My wife and her parents, every single day, they're FaceTiming on the phone. They're close and connected on a daily basis. But as I've realized and seen more, the price my mom paid and how much she adored me and my brother and how much she invested in us. We're talking today about the discipline of worship. And this word worthy keeps coming up in my head when I think about my mom. She was worthy of my admiration. She was worthy of me being her friend. She was worthy of me not getting too busy for her. And I have regrets in that area. And the way it ties into worship, I think you'll see right away, is we've got this God that has done everything for us. This God that every breath in your lungs comes from Him. Every time you're able to open your eyes of a morning, it's because of the spark of life that He put in you. Anything good that will ever happen in your entire life came as a direct result of His goodness flooding the universe. And in some sense, it's kind of like I was with my mom, is we get busy or we get distracted, we get involved in other things, and we don't give God the admiration that God deserves. And so when we talk about the discipline of worship, that's what we're talking about. It's almost like I'm talking about the discipline of being in love. It's almost like the discipline of awe and wonder and reverence. And we'll talk about it as we go on, but all these disciplines we've been talking about, whether it's solitude or whether it's prayer or whether it's meditation, this one word worship is where they all lead. This is like the goal. The goal is worship. A few weeks ago I talked about solitude and how there was a moment when I was in Trinidad and I looked up and it was like I had seen the stars for the very first time because I was in another hemisphere, there were no lights around, and you could flat see the stars. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced that. And when we talk, so the discipline of solitude is what leads to seeing the stars for the first time. But the discipline of worship is the discipline of properly responding once you've seen them. So all these other disciplines we've talked about lead to this one big discipline of wow, of worship. So when I pray, it's because I'm connecting with my lover. When I meditate, it's because I'm connecting with my lover. When I'm in solitude, all these other things, when I'm studying, it's because I'm wanting to connect with the God of the universe, resulting in worship. One of my favorite psalms says, "When I consider the heavens, the work of thine fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him?" And just like standing out in front of the stars and seeing them for the very first time and feeling incredibly small, I'm convinced that when you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is what Jesus said that God wanted from you, that something happens where you're able to say, wow, I am tiny. I am not deserving. I am nothing in the grand scheme of things, and yet you noticed me. That's what this passage says. It says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you watch over him?" How is it even possible that the Creator of the stars even knows my name? And yet He does. And He's worthy of my admiration. He's worthy of my worship. He's worthy of my songs. He's worthy of my dance. He's worthy of me raising my hands to Him, of getting on my knees and weeping in front of His presence. He is worthy of, He deserves that. God deserves our worship. Kara and I went to the symphony recently, the Louisville Symphony Orchestra, and they were playing Tchaikovsky, and we actually, due to a GPS internet error, ended up coming in late and coming in halfway through the performance. And so we sat in the second movement, basically. And if you've ever been to the orchestra, or if you've ever seen Les Mis, if you've ever been to a professional music situation like this, what you find is that the music ebbs and flows. The great musicians, they build you up and then they bring you down, and then they build you up and they bring you down. And I find that, there'll be this fast tempo place where the timpani is banging and it just kind of makes your heart beat fast and it's exciting. But then they bring it down to a single violin, just kind of a piercing wail or almost silent melody. And something happens to my emotions that there really isn't anything else on earth that can duplicate it. Seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time, watching the sunset from Key West, these things, and some of them I've talked about prior, God has built in His artistry that we can watch and be amazed. And when we hear music, we have to understand that He was the one that designed our eardrums. He was the one that knew ahead of time what a violin would sound like. He was the one that knew your feet would start tapping. He was the artist. If you look at an oil painting, all the artist can do that does an oil painting is try to duplicate what God already did. That's the best they can possibly do. is they can look at a sunset and try to make you feel what it looks like to look at a sunset. But God created the sunset. He's the ultimate artist. He's the ultimate creator. He is worthy of our worship and praise. Our author in Celebration of Discipline says, worship is our response to the overtures of love from the heart of the Father. You guys are familiar with the story of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son, of course, rejected his father. He said, Dad, I want all my stuff. He said, I want my inheritance and I want it now. And in that culture, he was basically saying, Dad, I just wish you would die so I could get a hold of your stuff. And he took off and lived all kinds of wild lifestyle. And at one point, and this is Jewish culture, so this is the dredges, this is the lowest it gets. At one point, he's feeding the pigs, which are considered a very unclean, nasty animal. He's feeding the pigs, and he's out of money. He's spent it all on prostitutes and gambling and all kinds of stuff. And he finally says, at least if I lived in my dad's house, he said I could get out of the pig slop. And so he goes back to his dad, and his plan is to say, Dad, I'm sorry. Can I live as one of your servants so that at least I'll have a roof over my head? And this is what the passage says. This is how the father responds to the son who abandoned him. It says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And listen to this. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. So he's watching for his son to come back. He's watching for you. He's scanning the world, and there's many passages in Scripture that say God is looking for people that he can run to and he can kiss and he can embrace and bring them in. And what you find in the story is he brings him in with full benefits. He brings him back in as an heir. And his other brother's even pretty ticked off about it because he's not near as merciful as his father is. But God could be anything. God could be a hammer-fisted, angry, lightning bolt kind of God. He could be mad at you all the time, but he's not. He's gentle and compassionate and caring and merciful and worthy of our worship. Jesus was thirsty one day. His disciples had gone off to get lunch, and I hate these old Victorian pictures of Jesus where he's a white guy with golden locks, but that's what you've got here. He wasn't. He was a very dark-skinned guy, and he was probably not very attractive from what we understand in Scripture. But he was this grizzly, pock-faced guy that sat down next to a well one day, and there's this woman there who's a Samaritan, and the Samaritans are enemies. And so she's a woman and she's a Samaritan, which means this Jewish rabbi has zero business talking to this woman. And yet he says, hey, would you get me a drink? And they start up this conversation. She says, why would you even ask me to get a drink? And in that conversation, she starts to get a little uncomfortable, changes the subject, and he brings it back to focus. And he talks about this. He talks about true worshipers, and he says, a time will come, the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So Jesus says that when we talk about the discipline of worship, when we talk about that word, worship, that there's something spiritual about it. And there's something that, there's a truth required in it. Let's, actually, I don't want to jump ahead just yet. He indicates that there's something inside where worship is concerned that you can't necessarily see on the outside. That there's something spiritual. It's in the spirit that real worship occurs. And so you can't look at someone and say, wow, they're really worshiping. You don't know if they're really worshiping. What you can know is where you are in your sincerity and your passion for God and your worship. That's what you need to keep a finger on. That's the pulse you need to be feeling for. Warren Wiersbe says worship is the believer's response of all that they are, mind, emotions, will, body, to what God is and says and does. If you've ever been in love, you know that body, soul, mind, and strength gets involved. If you've ever been in love, if you've ever seen someone that, they did it for you, you know that something happens that's physical, you feel it in your gut, it's mental, it's emotional, it's all-encompassing. You can't stop thinking about this person. And when God says, love me with heart, soul, mind, and strength, what he's saying is be passionate, be sincere, love me. He created you to be in a love relationship with him. Now, what does that look like exactly? Well, it's not exactly clear. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of passages in Scripture that seem to indicate ways that God likes to be worshiped and ways that are natural responses to this God that we deserve to be, that deserves our praise, that is worthy. You come in a church service like this and you see some people raise their hands and some people who don't. Some people who clap and some people who don't. Some people who weep and some people who don't. And I'm here to tell you that it's not about the form of the worship. Our author says this. He says, if any form hinders us from experiencing the living Christ, too bad for the form. It means if it doesn't help you connect with Him and love Him, then you need to abandon it. There's a movie called Believe Me that Andrew Lutz turned me on to. And in this movie, there's 3 or 4 con men that are conning a bunch of Christians. They've created this fake Christian charity, and they're presenting it to the masses at these big conferences, and they're collecting money, and they're giving a little bit to the charity, but most of it they're just banking. And at some point, they get together to try to figure out, how do we convince people that we're Christians? Like, how do we pull over this con? And so they're talking about what to do in a worship service. And he's got his little pegboard, his flip chart, and he starts with what he calls the gecko. And he says the gecko is this. You just keep your hands down like this, and maybe you'll want to look at the ceiling. And he says, you're kind of worshiping, but it's kind of hard to tell. And this is the gecko. And then he talks about the casual high five. The casual high five is one hand in the pocket, one hand up in the air, and you're just kind of high-fiving God. Just giving God a little high five, just like that. And, this is a more advanced move. And then he says, but what you really want to get to is called the Shawshank. And the Shawshank is like this. And he said, and one of the guys says, well, do I jump up and down during the Shawshank? He said, no, just some calf raises. Just little calf raises when you do the Shawshank. And he says, but what you want to be careful about, he says, you don't want to be the only person Shawshanking in a room full of geckos. You want to be careful about how you do this. And maybe it's even slightly blasphemous, the whole picture of it. But when you think about that scene, doesn't the reality set in that you can do all kinds of things and never worship? You can act all kinds of ways and never worship. And so whether a person is, white knuckle in the seat in front of them and saying, I will not raise my hands, I will not raise my hands, or whether they're high-fiving God, just chilling, they got coffee in one hand and high-five in the other, you don't know. What you do know is where you're at and where your sincerity level is and whether you are worshiping God in spirit and in truth. And so my encouragement to you today is to be passionate about God. Be fearless in that passion. Just decide once and for all that I love God and I don't care who knows. It doesn't mean that you're seeking power over people by saying you should all be like me. What you're saying is I love God and I'm willing to live that out in front of people. I'm willing to be identified with Him. Worship always results in giving yourself over. And that's, in my opinion, where true worship lies. We've been talking about the disciplines. We talked about the discipline of confession last week. There's a passage in, I believe it's Isaiah. He says, woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. You see that confession is a response based in worship. When you've seen God, and you've seen His holiness, and you've seen His goodness, and you've seen His power, and the price that He paid for you, it's a natural response to enter into the discipline of confession. It's natural to fall on your knees and say, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. It's a normal response. And if you don't have that response, chances are you're not seeing Him as clearly as you could. The disciplines are based in worship. I talked about solitude recently, and I talked about how putting the phone away, for example. I had lunch with Chris Leikwig this week, and we ate at Panera. And I had my phone with me, and I'm sitting there by myself. I got there early. I do this on purpose sometimes. Got there early, and I have 2 options. I can get on my phone. I had some work I could do. I could get on my phone and do some work. I could get on my phone and get on Facebook if I wanted to. There's all kinds of things I could do on my phone. I've got books that I'm reading on Kindle. But I decided, and part of it was because I'd been doing this teaching on solitude, I decided to put that thing down. I just decided I'm going to put the phone down, and I'm going to breathe, and I'm going to look around. And I noticed this picture on the wall of bread. I'm at Panera. And it's actually a drawing. It's not a picture like this. It's a drawing of bread. And I thought that would be out of place anywhere else in the world. But at Panera, it made sense. And I started thinking about bread and how awesome God is, how worthy He is. He knew that if we took wheat and we took the right parts of wheat, and that there would be fields full of this stuff, and if we would grind it all together, and I don't know how to make bread, but he knows, and he knew ahead of time that if you grind it all together and you put it with the right materials, it'll make certain kinds of bread. And if you put other types of materials that also come from plants and put them all together, you could make these edible foods out of it that would be delicious. And he knew that if you put it in an oven, or if you put it near a fire at the right temperature, that the outside would get crisp and flaky and the inside would be soft and tender and delicious. And he knew about bread from the beginning of the universe. And he is worthy of me saying, wow. And then I started thinking about butter. And he designed these stupid animals to walk around with these milk bags on them, that if you yank on those suckers long enough, you get this substance out of them. And if you sweep the top of that off and you put it in one of these, you can smear it on your bread, and it's incredible. And here, this is my point, is the disciplines lead you to worship. So I took the discipline of solitude. I took a moment to just stop, say no, quiet, silence, think, and there God was. And I was in reverence. I was in awe. I was expressing my admiration for Him. Worship occurred because I said solitude. Worship occurs because you study. Worship occurs because you meditate. And all these other disciplines that we've talked about lead to worship. Our author decided that for 1 year, he was going to learn God's vocabulary. He says, I determined to learn His vocabulary. Is He addressing me through those singing birds or that sad face? I sought to allow Him to move through my every action, my fingers while writing, my voice while speaking, to punctuate each minute with inward whisperings of adoration, praise, and thanksgiving. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about worship. We can talk, and we will briefly talk about what we mean when we have a worship service. But I'm talking about an inner attitude of daily admiration for the one who is due our admiration. I'm talking about every single day going through life saying, in Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. It says, which is your reasonable act of service. It makes sense with a mother who endured 24 hours of labor, invested all her money, all her time in me. It is just a reasonable act of service that I would befriend her, that I would stay with her, that I would stay in family and in a close relationship with her. And in God, because of who He is and how great He is, it's a reasonable act of service that we surrender. It's a reasonable act of service to say, I'm yours. What do you expect from me? What do you want from me? Wow, you're amazing. And he decided that he was going to do it for a year. And he says it wasn't easy. He admits it. He says, often I failed for hours, even days at a time, but each time I came back and tried again. And that year did many things for me, but it especially heightened my sense of expectancy in public worship. And so, if you come in here on a Sunday morning, we call this a worship service, right? And all week long, God has been on the back burner. Well, then when the band starts playing, when the music starts filling the room, when the prayers occur, and your mind is scattered in 1,000 different directions, it makes sense. It also makes sense that if throughout the week you're noticing the bread on the wall, if throughout the week you're seeing the stars, if throughout the week you're opening the Psalms and reading about the passion people had for God, that when you come in here and the music starts playing, or the message starts coming out, or the prayers start happening, that you are able to connect and you are able to worship. And so when we talk about, it'd be easy as a pastor to get up here and start kicking people around saying, okay, on Sunday mornings, this, and this is what you ought to do. It's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is you should do your best to live every moment of every day in the admiration that is due God. And when you live your life that way, then public worship becomes something with expectancy and excitement. Something that you come in and you're thrilled to be here. You're thrilled to be connected with your brothers and sisters and in community with them. So he said that after a year of trying to worship God regularly, it affected his public worship. He talks about how when you wake up in the morning, your first thoughts are of God. He says when you go to the gas station and you're filling the tank of your car and God points somebody out to you and you go start a conversation with them, that's an act of worship because you have plenty of things you could do with your day. There's all kinds of ways that you can worship, but worship is a daily activity. Now, with all that said, you've got the daily stuff going on. You are worshiping God throughout the day. You're giving Him your admiration. What does it mean for public worship? And we know that from the very beginning of Christianity, Christians gathered to worship. You see it all throughout the New Testament, but you also see it in a Roman historian named Pliny the Younger. And Pliny the Younger was actually torturing and killing Christians in about 115 AD. And he had written a letter to the Emperor Trajan saying, I'm capturing all these Christians. I don't really know what to do with them. Some of them confess to be Christians, some of them don't. Some of them repent and worship the Roman gods, and some of them won't. What do I do with these guys? So far, I've just been torturing them and killing them. Is that cool? Trajan writes him back and says, yeah, that's cool. You're doing the right thing. But this is what Pliny the Younger wrote about the Christians. He says, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verse a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves to a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, not to deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it. So Pliny the Younger says these Christians are getting together, and here's how we know that they're pretty messed up, is because they're singing to this Jesus like He's a God. And they're getting together and they're all committing to one another that they're not going to go lie, cheat, and steal. And, we just don't like these guys, so we're having them executed. But what we know is from the beginning of Christianity, people gather just like we're doing here on a Sunday morning. And they committed themselves to God. They worshiped Him through music, and then they made a commitment to Him. The author, Richard Foster, that we've been reading, said this of gathering together. They were gathered in a sense that they met together as a group, and second, they were gathered into a unity of spirit that transcended their individualism. And so the corporate gathering like this is you worship God throughout the week, but then we come together and we worship Him together. And God wants to do something in us as a community. And part of the Sunday morning thing is coming in and being a part of a community. So what is that? Here, I've got 4 tips for you real quick on the public worship, the public community, the worship service. And the first is prepare. It's super easy to come into a Sunday morning service just totally discombobulated because you're running late and the kids were screaming or you're arguing with your spouse or people from work called. I would encourage you to make Sunday mornings a sacred time in your life and do your best to come in at peace, calm, come a little early, sit, think, pray, communicate with one another. It just simply is tougher to enter into the presence of God and what God is doing if you come in 12 minutes late, frazzled and harried and hassled, rather than, I would just encourage you to make it a point that when you come in on Sunday mornings, you come in with a sense of expectancy, that you come in prepared. Second is this Greek word koinonia, and koinonia is translated about 20 times in the New Testament, and it means fellowship. And so, he talked about how you leave your individualism aside when you come to a church setting. And what we do is we come in and we sit in our seat and we think about us and our life and what we want God to do, or me worshiping God. And his idea is that when we come in as a community, that we worship in community, that we tie into what God is doing as a whole, in general, in our community. That it isn't just a me thing when we come in, but it's an us thing. It's probably something we can talk about later. I would say seek sincerity. Now, worship looks different for different folks. Some people do the gecko, some people do the Shawshank. I watched a Broncos game with Bill DeGoyer last week, and we're both Broncos fan. That's because he's awesome and I'm awesome. And we watched the Broncos game together, and Bill is a relatively reserved guy. Bill's a chemist, and he's a scientist, and he kind of acts like a scientist. I think everybody that knows him would say he's relatively reserved. So when the Broncos score a touchdown, he might say, "Hey, they scored a touchdown even though I'm watching the game. That's pretty cool." And that's, or in his fantasy team, Rob Gronkowski got his knee hurt last week. He said, "Oh no, not Gronkowski." Just real reserved. Now, if the Broncos score a touchdown, I'm pumping my fist. I'm not jumping up and kicking the coffee table, but I'm like, yeah. And I get a little more into it. Now, Pat Wright, who I don't know is here today or not, but Pat Wright is a UK fan. My understanding is that Pat Wright, when she watches a UK game, she has to go to a separate section of the house. And that they can hear lamps crashing and boards splitting and windows being busted out and screaming. And apparently she's quite boisterous in her admiration for the UK Wildcats basketball program. And so when you take me and Bill and Pat and you put us in a room together and say they play some music, it would be totally natural and normal that we would have different responses. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing at all. So I'm not asking you when you come in here to be something you're not, but I am asking you to be sincere, to be passionate about what you're doing when you come here. And it will look different for different people. But with that caveat, I would also say that you need to love God. And part of being a good lover is finding out what your lover wants. In order to effectively love someone and effectively connect with them in a way that is meaningful and deep, it helps to find out who they are and what their passions are and what they like. And so part of the question, whether it's for Bill or for me or for Pat, when we come into a worship service like this, would be, how does God want me to worship? And I think there's a balance there between enthusiasm and passion and zeal and demonstrative worship and silence and serenity and meditation. And I think if you read scriptures, you see all of it. And so the goal would be to come in sincerity of heart, saying to God, what could I give you today? Instead of coming in saying, what can I take from you today? You come in with a different attitude, and it's one of worship. It's one of, you are worthy. I'm here to tell you you are worthy. How do I do that most effectively? How do I do that best? And so I would encourage you, read the Psalms. Read the Psalms and find out, what does God like when His people worship Him? And you're going to see things like raised hands. You're going to see things like clapping and shouting and dancing. You're going to see demonstrative forms of worship. But you're also going to see people down on their knees weeping. You're going to see people sitting in silence. And I think as a Christian, whether it's in public or in private, our worship ought to run the gambit of what does God like. Let's give it to Him. And I'll close with this idea from one of my favorite authors, Clive Staples. He says, the most valuable thing the Psalms do for me is to express the same delight in God which made David dance. When you read the Psalms and you see this real serious, he was a character, David. He was a murderer and he was just a mess. But what you find in the life of David is that David danced before God in public, unafraid, unashamed that my identity is with Him. He wasn't afraid to lift his hands. He wasn't afraid to clap. He wasn't afraid to pray out loud. He wasn't afraid to sing. And yet you also see him in private on his knees, weeping before God, being honest and pouring out his heart. And so I believe that as Christians, our entire life ought to look like worship to Him. Whether we're stopping at the bank teller to make a withdrawal or whether we're standing in here doing the Shawshank and calf raises, whatever it is, that when God looks into your heart and He sees your mind and He sees your motives, He says, that one loves me. That one appreciates me. That one admires me.